This video is going to examine global political economic theory with a special focus on the environment. And the discussion of global political economy will start with a consideration of its origins in the work of Wallerstein and Braudel and the world systems theory perspective, as well as Andre Gunder Frank and the dependency theory perspectives, and we'll say more about those in a moment. But what these share in common is a focus on international forms of inequality and the types of exploitative relationships that exist between countries. And since we're thinking about the environment, we're going to kind of just spell out how those forms of exploitation result in a host of inequities and injustices, both economically, environmentally, but also as well as socially. World systems theory begins with a historical understanding of the world economy, many times beginning with the capitalist world system of colonialism, and that traces its roots all the way back to the 14th century. And there are some scholars who argue it might even be traceable to earlier times, such as under some of the powerful empires that once existed, including the Mongolians or the Romans, or the Persians, for example. And it's important to understand this kind of international global history in order to appreciate what we have in the world today, because we see, in fact, a great deal of continuity. So according to world systems theory, we live in a very highly stratified world economy, with core countries at the middle of things enjoying the highest quality of life, not to mention quantity if we look at demographic factors. That's where the life expectancy is greatest. And on the opposite end of the spectrum are the peripheral countries, which are the poorest. In many cases, life expectancy hovers around 49, 50 years old for these countries. So they're lagging far behind on a number of indicators. Environmental problems are no exception. The core countries enjoy high levels of consumption of a wide range of materials, and oftentimes the production of those goods or the byproducts of that production are experienced in the peripheral or the semi-peripheral countries, which are somewhere in the middle of the core and peripheral countries in the scheme of things. So the question is, how can unequal exchange between core, peripheral, and semi-peripheral nations be halted? And that's one of the core questions of world systems theory in order to bring about some form of social justice and sustainability. So just briefly, thinking about definitions, what is a core nation? At least features of core nations involve maintaining a diverse economy. It's a heavy trade of imports and exports, but the vast majority of exports tend to be higher-end consumer goods, and imports tend to be natural resources or lower order kind of manufacturing products. Peripheral nations are the poorest we mentioned, tend to be highly agricultural or suffer from the resource curse, as it's been called. This kind of narrow export economy develops, and these nations depend very heavily on the export of a narrow range of exports. Semi-peripheral nations have features of that sometimes, but they also can look like core countries in that they often are the host of different types of manufacturing, but usually not the higher order, high-cost manufacturing goods. So this image, these images both kind of capture what kind of dynamics we're talking about with the world system, with the core countries exporting high-profit consumer goods, importing cheap labor and raw materials, and semi-peripheral countries having somewhat of a mixture of those characteristics, and peripheral countries, of course, are importing the high-profit goods and they're exporting the cheap labor and materials, which is a very disadvantageous location in the world system. At the heart of the world economy, and now this gets us a little past the initial thinking of world systems theory and incorporates some contemporary thought, particularly with the rising role of multinational corporations at the heart of things, facilitating global trade, and to a large degree, multinational corporations have replaced nation states on some level, at least, with regard to how the world economy functions. Under colonialism, this was primarily nation states duking it out, going to war with each other, staking out different claims on different colonies, and exploiting the resources. And now it's corporations that have replaced the nation state in this kind of quest to find new markets, new resources, new workers, and so forth. And multinational corporations are, of course, guided by a desire to make a profit and do so in a highly competitive context. Those that are not profitable tend to perish, and those that are tend to continue on. So, multinational corporations, as a result of their desire to maximize profits, will sort of shop around looking for the best place to do business, and that, of course, means cutting corners where it's possible, externalizing costs to the environment, paying the minimal amount for labor, because that's going to maximize profits, and usually they can find a willing partner, a peripheral or semi-peripheral nation that's willing to provide what multinationals are looking for, and because this is a competitive global economy, many nations are almost blackmailed into accepting rather poor business practices, and there's almost no oversight. So this is one of the interesting things about the world system, the world economy, is that global corporations, multinational or transnational corporations, they don't really have anybody to answer to. There is no international governmental body that they have to follow some kind of international laws. Instead, there's a patchwork system of national level laws, and this allows corporations to sidestep anything that doesn't seem desirable. So we can tie this back to some other political economy theories, such as treadmill of production, which is, of course, one of the ones we've looked at elsewhere, also focused on environmental outcomes, but with similar claims about how the economy works under capitalism and the way corporations are caught up in this competitive game to outcompete one another and find the cheapest path to profit at the expense of labor and the environment. And we see the global economy does increase the distance between consumption and production, and that's something else that separates contemporary world economic dynamics from older forms, which were somewhat more localized. Not entirely. The colonial system, of course, had global dimensions, but the day-to-day production and consumption of goods was much more localized under colonialism, and of course prior to colonialism. So treadmill is like world systems theory or dependency theory, which has been largely subsumed into world systems theory. They all sort of view development and economic protection as antithetical, and that's what sets them apart from ecological modernization theory, where multinational corporations are viewed as at least having the potential to be sustainable, and therefore economic growth and environmental protection are not viewed as antithetical and can coexist, even within the context of a global capitalist economy. And that is something that really separates the different theories of political economy. So one of the key ideas to think about as we compare these is, what is the capacity we have to enforce global standards in order to hold multinational corporations accountable and to a higher level of corporate social responsibility or sustainability. So on one model for regulating multinational corporations is to have a higher level of global governance, and that means maybe using existing frameworks such as the United Nations, which is a league of countries that negotiate with one another, but the United Nations is not itself truly a governmental body, and it doesn't regulate corporations, it regulates countries. So this was a more fitting response to colonialism, and of course emerged after World War II, which is when the colonial powers really kind of came to the ultimate battle. So the United Nations does not directly challenge multinational corporations. It certainly doesn't challenge the underlying global capitalist system, profit motive, and so forth, and generally believes that good economic decisions will be green, making the ideology of the UN more consistent with an ecological modernization paradigm. There's also the World Trade Organization, which does regulate multinational corporations, but this is not a governmental body either. It's in fact a private tribunal where decisions are made behind closed doors. There's no democratic input whatsoever. And so there's really not much concern with anything besides economic justice between the different participatory nations and companies. World polity theory offers an interesting perspective on this and says, instead of turning to governmental bodies to regulate corporations, what we could do is promote a global counterweight, which is essentially in the form of international governmental organizations or non-governmental organizations that can, of course, be environmental in focus or can have other foci as well. And what these can do is they can provide even poor countries with a certain amount of assistance and support. They can provide resources, expertise, and they can help countries fight out their environmental battles or their labor battles, as the case may be. So this is driven at first by grassroots actions within the peripheral or semi-peripheral nations, but evolve eventually into some kind of institutional form. And that is how we know social movements are succeeding. And as we've seen with the environmental movement, that has been the case to a large degree, and there are a number of organizations out there. So the key question, can we govern the world? We have this race to the bottom, so to speak, multinational corporations racing each other to find the cheapest resources and labor, cutting corners as much as possible to increase profits so that shareholders are happy and continue to hold on to their shares of the companies and so forth. The greatest resistance coming from a grassroots social movement, which is global in scale, and international organizations that they have created and in fact interact with and rely upon. That is a core feature of world polity theory. And they of course want to change the global governance structure and ultimately the rules of the global economy to hold all actors more accountable. So the question here is, can progress be made without radical changes to global structure? And once again, I think that brings us back to the fundamental difference between an ecological modernization paradigm and ideas associated with the global political economic perspective. All this discussion of global political economy really needs to be put in perspective by thinking about the extent to which there are global injustices and global inequalities. And this graph was taken from Magdoff's 2013 article, Global Resource Depletion, and it's a examination of global consumption by decile. So what we see, and I know it's a little fuzzy, but the top 10% of the world consumes 60% of the world's resources. The next decile consumes about 18%. So between the two, we're looking at about 78 to 80% of the world's resources being consumed in the top 20%. And you can see it just kind of trails off in a very, what we call an exponential way. This is certainly not a normal distribution. This is a logarithmic distribution, as so many things on the global level are. And that's why when researchers study these issues, they have to use log transformations many times in order to do statistical techniques. But what we see in this graph, of course, is just the picture of inequality, right? High level of decadence and wealth at the top and very little at the bottom rung, and that includes the bottom 50%, which between half of humanity to be forced to share about 5 to 6% of the world's resources is quite unfair, and by just about any standards. And of course, where does this come from? Again, this didn't just happen overnight. This is an outgrowth of the history we were talking about earlier. Today's poor countries are yesterday's colonies. Today's wealthy countries are yesterday's colonial powers. The distribution of wealth and resources and power, it has shifted somewhat, but there are some notable continuities as well. Many of today's most privileged countries had a favorable position under colonialism, with a few exceptions. And so, modernization theory is often held up also as a contrast to global political economic, world system, and dependency theory perspectives, because it believes, like the ecological modernization perspective, that all boats can rise, that all nations can develop robust economies while at the same time protecting the environment. And that is quite antithetical to the world system view, which views growth and protection as a zero-sum game. So the history of global inequality, we see that investments have been made by the global community through the IMF, the United Nations, the World Bank, in an effort to promote economic development using a modernizationist kind of paradigm, have invested and made loans to poor countries to help them jumpstart their economies. And unfortunately, the gap between the rich and the poor from the beginning of these initiatives to the present day has only grown wider. But we can also note that even though the gap between them has grown, that all countries have improved their lot at the same time. So this is an interesting kind of paradoxical outcome. But one of the key concerns for those in the global political economy perspective, and thinking about all this effort to jumpstart the economies of poor countries, is the phenomenon of structural adjustment loans and traps. And essentially what that means is loans given out by the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, are very difficult to pay back. And in order to accept the loans, nations have to accept a number of policies that essentially open their economy up to other actors, the multinational corporations we were talking about, and privatizing the public sector infrastructure to a large degree. And that, of course, has led to some major confrontations, for instance, when there have been efforts to privatize water, just as an example, where this has historically been viewed as a human right. It's now being turned into a commodity. And that means some people are going to potentially not be able to afford their water, which is quite an interesting kind of and horrendous outcome of all this. So the idea is to help countries reshape their economy to enable them to pay off their debts, but these debts oftentimes are insurmountable. And debt forgiveness is something that can help, and in fact that's maybe one of the only things that can really allow any kind of sovereignty for recipients of these loans. But as part of the package of accepting the loans, there have to be huge cuts in government spending in the public sector in general. That includes basic social services and any kind of subsidies that might be given out to farmers for food products. And it encourages a reliance on exports, right? And that, of course, as we mentioned, creates a great deal of vulnerability in the economy of these countries. So, to a large degree, world system theorists, other global political economists, using similar paradigms such as unequal ecological exchange or something like that, they all kind of view things in this way, that many of these efforts have really just created underdevelopment, that instead of helping countries, we've really just hurt them, and that is evidenced by the expanding gap between the rich and poor. So the structure of the world economy encourages underdevelopment. The treadmill-driven logic has really undermined the sovereignty and the well-being of less developed countries. And because investment comes in the form of loans and not gifts most of the time, this is a difficult situation to come out of. And, of course, on the other side of that, there's huge profit to be gained from these loans. And keeping someone in debt, think of credit card companies. They don't really make much profit if the credit card holders always pay off their credit card every month. It's the ones who make minimum payments, who can never seem to get out of the credit card debt, that are really the source of the most profit. So, world systems theory views the process of development as inherently unequal. divides the world up into the categories we mentioned, and it privileges the core to the detriment, especially of the periphery, but to some degree the semi-periphery as well. And differences in power means that wealth tends to flow to the core from the periphery and semi-peripheral zones, and over time development only gets wider. The gap only gets wider. The environmental implications of this: peripheral nations are really sacrificing their resources in order to have an economy that they are exporting out to core countries to be processed and turned into higher end goods. Because of the lack of government regulations, the citizens, the workers, the people living in these countries are often exposed to incredible amounts of contaminants, toxic waste, and many just accept that as the cost of progress. And one of the worst examples of that was the Union Carbide chemical leak over Bhopal, India, which claimed the lives of thousands of people and maimed many thousands more. And so when we step back and look at the global economy, consumption is mainly in the core. There is the higher end production we mentioned, but that tends to be cleaner types of production. And so the environmental consequences of consumption and production are really just relocated to other parts of the world. And certainly there's a good share of landfills and these kinds of things in core countries. They're not without environmental problems, but they are definitely on the better end of things, and things are often improving in these countries where the regulations tend to be stricter. And as the economy goes in the direction of being a service economy, where people aren't even making money on goods but on services, that really holds the most potential for sustainable outcomes. And that's not a reality for peripheral countries, which don't have much of a service economy. They still rely heavily on natural resources, farming, and manufacturing, especially in the semi-periphery. And that's going to wrap up our discussion of global political economy with a special focus on environmental outcomes. Thanks for watching.